Okay, so this paper is kind of continuation of Braden's and answering hopefully some of y'all's questions, but it's talking about the role of vowels and consonants within specific acoustic characteristics in the intelligibility of words and sentences. So before we get started, I want to kind of give some definitions about what we're talking about. That way we can understand what they're analyzing and what they're doing experiments on. And so fundamental frequency, I'm not going to go over because we've been over it a lot in this class, but it's basically the lowest frequency of a sound, which is the vibration of your vocal cords. The speech envelope is slow modulations of amplitude over time. So basically this is things like intonation, prosody, stress, syllable segmentation, kind of the overall tone of how you're saying something. Whereas the temporal fine structure is more focused on like the smaller details, articulation, the sounds you're actually making, the words you're making. So think of it kind of like looking at the trees to the forest, whereas the speech envelope is like the overall view of what you're looking at, whereas the temporal fine structure is more of the actual individual details. And so here, if you look, you can see the blue, all the little cycles for it are the phase cycles within speech production. And so you can see the amplitude over time. And so the temporal fine structures is all of the individual cycles of a sound or a word being said, whereas the speech envelope is the red line above it, and that is like the overall form and shape of whatever waveform is being produced. And so in this paper, there are a couple of assumptions that they had made going into it just based on previous research. And so one of the first things that they had said was that auditory speech presentation, so being able to actually understand what is happening, consonants and vowels are characterized by different acoustic features. So the way that you say a vowel will have different distinguishable and analyzable aspects than you would say a consonant. Second thing that they made an assumption about within the premise of these experiments is that acoustic cues during defined vowels tend to have a higher impact of intelligibility compared to consonants. So if you have a word or a phrase and there are some parts of it that are blurred out, typically you want to have vowels to help increase intelligibility compared to having the consonants, which still are important, but don't have as strong of an impact as vowels do. So the third one that they do is that the roles of vowels and consonants are different in terms of what information they provide you. And so consonants and vowels do have separate meanings within words and phrases and sentences, and those things vary based on which they are. So kind of a summation of that as the vowels and consonants are different and they have different meanings, which I'm sure is a shock to all of you. And so this study ran two different experiments that kind of analyzed same or similar but different questions. The first experiment was looking at the role of how fundamental frequency changes impact intelligibility within words and sentences. And the second experiment analyzed the same thing, but instead of fundamental frequency, it evaluated the difference of a speech envelope and highlighting those characteristics versus TFS. And so seeing if you emphasize or highlight characteristics of one versus the other, what those things look like. And so what the paper had explained it that TFS sounds almost like, TFS sounds very clear, like intonation and prosody is very evident and you can hear what's happening, but the words sound very jumbled and slurred together. Whereas a speech envelope highlighting those characteristics sounds what they compare to a cochlear implant. So it sounds really robotic. You're able to hear the words very clearly, but there's not a lot of intonation or phrasing or stress that goes along with those different characteristics. And so we're going to go into the first experiment and talk a little bit about what they did there. And so the methods and materials of what they did is the same for 1 and 2, just how they changed the stimuli is what the study actually is about. And so for the first experiment, going into fundamental frequencies and how that impacted it, they had participants here, it's about 200 of a mix of words and sentences and words in isolation that were consonant, vowel, consonant, monosyllabic words, and then sentences that were meaningful speech, meaning like that actually made sense in context and grammar and syntax, all formed a legitimate sentence in English. And so they had them listen to it 3 different ways. So the first 2 was they did it where they either muffled the vowels or they muffled the consonants. That way you only heard one or the other. And then the third version of it was you heard both vowels and consonants with the impact of how they change fundamental frequency. And so I'll show you what that looks like within some of the figures I have in the paper in a minute. But some of the changes that they saw were that vowels and consonants were had different impacts based on intelligibility. So vowels typically had a higher intelligibility within sentences, but whenever it came to individual words, they were about equal in terms of what you were able to understand. And so some of the implications that they had given for this throughout the research was that basically how this works with hearing aids and cochlear implants of what you want to highlight whenever you're producing this technology of do you want to focus more on the actual words, articulatory sounds, or are you focusing more on prosody and stress and intonation? And so what they ended up finding is that you want to have the vowels and more of the actual articulatory sounds in there to make it more monotone, because those are the things that you need to be able to understand, because you can have the prosody and pitch, but if you don't know what's being said or if it sounds slurred, then you aren't really able to get the information out of it that you need. And so here is figure 1 and 2. This is in the paper if you want a clearer version of it. Let's see if I can get my laser pointer out. And so here you can see on the very far left is the unprocessed, meaning that this is just like what the actual sound or the actual phrase was. And the one that they ended up using in this was, in the pity for them, his loneliness is gone. That is the sentence that was used. For what reason? I don't know. And so here you can see the unprocessed, and this is what they actually heard without any editing on the audio. Here, the same thing, the middle row, but this one is vowel only. So they did speech sounding noise. So I looked this up because I had no idea what this is, but apparently it's a very big audiology thing where there is certain background noise that mimics long-term human speech that they played over the consonant sounds. And then here is the opposite. They covered all the vowels and only played the consonants. And so the very far left is unprocessed. The middle is flat fundamental frequency, which means that they took away any intonation and prosody. It sounds really monotone and robotic. And then no fundamental frequency essentially is like a whispered voice. So there was no vibration happening within the sounds. It's almost like there was no movement of the vocal folds, and it was just air coming through like you're whispering. And so it's kind of hard to see on the screen here, but if you look on the different parts of it, you can see how they do have like the curves that go with intonation and phrasing here, whereas the flat fundamental frequency is a straight line, and then no fundamental frequency, there's nothing here. And you can see with the vowels only, there's maybe a little bit less than half. It's about 45%, they said, of the vowels make up the phrasing and the words. And so you can still see that they have the intonation and the prosody, but it's less than it would be with the unprocessed, and then even less with the consonant and vowels. So if you look over here to the right side, they have sentences and words. And so this is the overall measure of all about 200-ish, and seeing how the black is the full sentence where they didn't mask the vowel or consonants. The gray is they mask the vowels only, and then white is they mask the consonants only. And so here you can see that vowels, having them opened where you can actually hear the vowels, had significantly more impact for intelligibility. So the higher it goes means the higher number of words they got correct. And so obviously if you can hear everything, you're able to understand what's being said. But they saw within all circumstances, within the sentences, that having the vowels unmasked, you can hear them, increase intelligibility by like upwards of 50% compared to the consonants being masked. And then looking at the individual words in isolation, so these are CVC monosyllabic words. And there wasn't really a significant difference between vowels and consonants being masked. There might be a little bit of an impact, but statistically, they were about the same. And so what they ended up finding was that changing fundamental frequency only had an impact within sentences and conversation. There wasn't really an impact in isolation in terms of intelligibility and understanding what's being said or what's being given. So moving on to the second study that they did, it's basically the exact same thing, same stimuli, same model, but they, instead of changing the fundamental frequency, they either changed the TFS or they changed the envelope, this overall speech envelope, so making it either more robotic and taking out the prosody and intonation and stress, or keeping all of those things there and taking away the individual articulatory features, making it sound more slurred. And so what they found is that for TFS, that only vowels were useful within context. And so consonants basically had no impact on intelligibility. If you had only consonants, you cannot understand anything. Whereas if you had vowels, there was a significant increase of intelligibility. Whereas, and this was for words and sentences, whereas for the envelope, it's a little bit different, where there's a stronger impact for vowels in sentences, just like with the fundamental frequency changes. And then similar, there's about equal impact whenever it comes to isolated words. And so same thing for experiment 2. Very far left is the unprocessed. The middle one is predominantly the envelope. And so you can see here how it's a bit of a wider like spectrogram imaging here, whereas for the predominantly TFS, where it is just the individual articulatory sounds, it's a lot more noise and a lot more static, that you can see all of the different waveforms coming up within the cycles. And so again, top is the full sentence, bottom is vowels only, so they could only hear the vowels, and then C only is they can only hear the consonants. And so whenever it came to TFS, you can see over here on the right, the gray box is the vowels only what they heard. The white box is the consonant onlys. There was zero intelligibility for consonant only, and they can only hear it if they had the full phrase or if they had the vowels with it. Whereas same thing here for the words, if you do the speech envelope or the overall prosody and intelligibility is there, you can kind of get an equal measure. Whereas for TFS, it was only for the vowels. And so one thing that they had assumed with this of why there might be a higher impact within the speech envelope for consonants, even though it's close to equal, but it's a little bit above for the sentences at least, is that you can't really separate the envelope from TFS because it's basically parts of a whole. And so despite how much they had tried to separate the characteristics of them, they couldn't fully take it away, which was a limitation of this study. And so because of that, they think that that did have an impact on the overall intelligibility for the speech envelope, because there was no way to fully distinguish those two characteristics, because they do make up with each other. And so a lot of the implications within this is just like how we can change technology, why all these different things matter within clinical research. And so like I mentioned earlier, hearing aids and cochlear implants, knowing what you want to focus on and what you want to be able to process whenever you're putting signals in matters to help increase intelligibility. And for people that have like moderate, severe, profound hearing loss, the focus isn't necessarily making it sound nice. It's just being able to make sure that you can hear what's happening around you in your context and your environment. And then similarly, also, this kind of shows, going back to Braden's presentation, of context does matter. It's not just about what's being said or the individual sounds or words, but it's having those things in context to help distinguish what's going on. And so for older people or people with progressive hearing loss that might be in a noisy environment or might work in loud environments, being able to realize that you can still hear a majority of the vowels and majority of the sounds and still get the point across, even if you can't hear every single individual sound within it. And so the results of the study overall demonstrated that vowels do have a significant impact within intelligibility. And so you can take away vowels and you can get less than half, whereas having the vowels, you typically get between 60 to 80% of what is trying to be said, which depends within familiarity and understanding of like what the topic is in conversation versus an unfamiliar topic. And so yeah, there are a lot of implications for this and a lot of questions are still unanswered of just like how this can be used in a more effective way. And so showing that meaningful sentences compared to isolation, that language does impact how we understand sounds, and that semantics do play a role in articulatory processing and motor planning, because you can know what the sound is, but not knowing what it is in context is meaningless. That's pretty much the gist of this paper. So, thank you.
Any questions? in clinical relevance for audiology, especially cochlear implant. And I think it's very interesting, like the idea that the vowels are contributing more in sentences, but not in isolation, both because when we're doing speech perception tests in audiology, especially with cochlear implant users, we're not really relying on any like sentence-based tasks. Like we do have some, but they're actually considered like they're like at the end of the protocol. Like you have to master the individual words before you get to that point before we start doing those. But also the idea that like really it's context based, it's like top down processing. So like how does this look different for an adult with a cochlear implant who has a postlingual hearing loss versus like a kid with a cochlear implant and prelingual hearing loss? Like do we need to focus on the same acoustic cues that we do for an adult versus a child? I don't know that we have an answer to that here.
I don't think we do. I mean, well, I will say that I don't know. I will say that one thing for speech testing that this had shown in with doing like overall phrasing intonation versus having the actual articulation is that within words there's like less than 50% of accuracy of getting what's trying to be said correctly, and this is like with having the consonants or vowels basically blocked out with static or speech noise. And so yeah, I don't know how effective y'all's testing really is because I don't do hearing testing, but just like having that mentality, having that knowledge of like how often do we actually hear words in isolation? You know, like most of our conversations are within context and phrases and sentences. We don't really just say things like one word at a time to each other.
A lot of the testing that we do is sort of like even sentences. It doesn't really rely on context because we use like kind of we just like jumble words together and call it a sentence.
Yeah.
Wait, not really internal sentences. They're more so diagnostic. It's a sentence, but it's like it's supposed to be that you like can't get what the sentence means from the context because we know if you have context it makes it easy.
So is it like implausible? Like it like the green box jumps over.
Yeah.
Box jumps over the yellow cloud.
Okay.
You can't necessarily
Tiny
infer
bit.
the meaning from it. So yeah, I think all of this is very relevant. But yeah, I think it's interesting as far as vowels, which is like, you know, what we talk about a lot. Because with vowels, what I would usually tell my patients is like vowels are kind of like the power, like they have more acoustic power behind them than like say like a fricative sound or something. But I think for our patients, it's important for them to actually be able to identify those more so consonants, like did they say which or did they say with? They don't necessarily, they don't have trouble with the vowels as much as they do with those like higher frequency.
Yeah.
Like one more time, like you say like the powers, the vowels, you know, the clarity is like the consonants, but for patients with like low frequency hearing, perhaps also the vowels are the clarity. Even if we take that out too.
Yeah, I guess that's like I think for me, I see more of that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know. I was just like, so do I. But, like, I'm thinking about it, and like, they also have something. I mean, for sure, because they're missing that as well. So then it's like, we should stop saying that.
Yeah, I mean, if vowels drive.
Well, vowels also add semantic meaning too of like present versus present, contract versus contract, record versus record. Like the emphasis you place on the vowels determines if it's a noun or a verb or like what the meaning of the word is too. And so that's a big part of why like they hypothesize that it had such a strong impact is because vowels add so much meaning into words of like you can within context assume with versus which. But if you're trying to say something with like a different vowel, like bed versus bid, like those have different words and different meanings behind them that might not make as much sense within a context.
Do you guys think as clinicians, did you focus on vowels more when you were working with clients?
No, when you work well.
Really?
But I feel like almost all of my clients, kids and adults, have had issues with consonants. Like vowels was always the easiest thing for them to do. And so the way that we work on it, or at least I did, I don't know if you did the same way, but like there are like eight, and then six of like groups of consonants that you develop in a certain order in childhood. And so typically you start with the easiest and then you work your way up through the hardest. And so, yeah, all of my kids and all of my adults that had various issues, it was always consonants.
Yeah, they like vowels is because it's really hard to hear if it's disordered or not. And there's dialect differences.
Yeah, and accents.
And then also usually like kids learn vowels first, so they're more likely to not have trouble with it. And if they do have trouble with vowels, it's a big red flag.
Yeah.
Then it might be like apraxia or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then it made me think about your research. When you're messing with the feedback, do you tend to mess with vowel sounds more, or like?
We do all sorts of different things. We mess with the unknown frequency within like vowel sounds. We also mess with the phoneme frequency of the vowel sound within like peak frequency. So they actually, we recently published a paper that from the perspective of like motor control theories, the motor system compensates for like changes in your perception of those alterations. But it appears that the way that it corrects for changes in the unknown frequency is independent of how they correct for changes in the phoneme frequency, because they are basically under the control of two relatively independent motor systems, one for laryngeal motor control as compared to the other one for like supralaryngeal structures, right? So there is still a lot of debate on if these two systems are completely independent, but from a perspective, you can just phonate without like really moving your articulators, and you can silently without really engaging your larynx, right? And also, when it comes to, we're going to read some articles on those. Hopefully, we'll get to a little bit of that, not as much detail. There are basically different weighting of sensory contribution from the somatosensory system versus the auditory system for motor control, right? So there's still like a lot of debate around the fact that which system is it, the larynx receiving more contribution from the auditory versus somatosensory, or vice versa? And also, if you lose your hearing, how does the somatosensory feedback takes over to help you compensate for lack of ability for motor production and control? But I can tell you that there are definitely much fewer number of experiments and papers on the somatosensory, because from a practical standpoint, it's much harder to perturb and alter somatosensory sensation compared to auditory. Auditory is like much easier. You just put a microphone, you take the signal, you run it through some closed and harmonizer effect processor, and you feed it back. Given the fact that there's going to be a little bit of a delay there because of the computational that is like in the middle, but it's much easier to manipulate changes in the auditory systems compared with somatosensory that requires much more, technologies for doing that. So there is still like a lot of debate around this whole concept of which is more important, but it appears that both of them receive at least some contribution from both. So these two sensory systems are competing with each other for fine-tuning the motor system, but the relative contribution, even in like neurotypical adults with normal speech, is debatable, and when it goes to clinical population, it becomes much more challenging. One of the other things that I actually noted from this figure, I don't think like they analyze it, but we talked about the role of context, right? So Christine also mentioned that. So I don't think like they analyze, like look at the black bars on the top panel A versus the bottom one, like sentences versus words. I don't think like they statistically analyze them because it was not originally part of the research hypothesis. And sometimes where you're designing like multifactorial experiments, you always need to sort of like optimize your factors, the number of factors that you want to analyze, because you don't want to lose your statistical power. So I don't think like they did it. So I can't really speak to whether or not there was a statistically significant differences between like the black lines in the top panel versus the bottom one. But it appears that in general, there's a degraded level of basically recognition accuracy when they're looking at the word level production versus the sentences. But the story changes. I wish they had the stats. Maybe they'll do a follow-up study when you're just focusing on the temporal finite structure versus the envelope, right? So there are systematic differences, at least by just eye rolling on the plots. If we had the stats, they could probably just like do more discussion on maybe something related to the context and within the sentences compared to the word production in isolation, right? So that would probably answer some of the other questions that we would
Yeah.
have in this discussion, right?
No, I thought before he started explaining, I thought that's, yeah.
Yeah. That would have been nice. One of the other things that Sophia mentioned about, so I always like try to put things in the context of the motor theories because I'm a motor speech person, right? So when you talked about like pre versus post lingually hearing impaired population, I always like think about like for those pre-lingually hearing impaired individuals, because we know that their motor production pattern is going to also get affected, right? So how does that contribute to their ability to perceive sound? So when we put that in the context of motor theory of a speech perception, the way that you produce is going to bias your perception. So if your production is not well calibrated because you did not have rich auditory input for learning the motor patterns for production, then how does that translate to maybe changes in your perceptual ability? So there are basically some competing factors that may or may not explain the way that pre versus post lingually, hearing impaired population may perceive sounds differently. But at least from the context of like things that we learned today from all the presenters, like in terms of like auditory model of the speech perception versus motor theory of a speech perception, or maybe a combination of both. So just like some food to for the mind to think about it. And maybe you guys will design some experiments in the future to answer this from a motoric like perspective, right? The motor theory of speech perception. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, ideas? This is great. I mean, this is how I really wanted the class to move forward. Just like mind stimulating discussions and a lot of unknown things. So it's just it's good to think about it, but maybe we don't know the answer to all of it. But it's just like good to learn from everybody.